before oil, before gold, there was something far more ordinary that quietly controlled empires. History tells us power comes from rare things, precious metals, scarce resources, hard-to-find wealth, and for a long time that seemed true. But the real story is different, because one of the most powerful forces in history was something almost everyone used every single day, something common, something essential, a substance people couldn't live without. And that's what made it dangerous, because when something becomes necessary, it becomes controllable. And when it's controlled, it can be turned into a weapon, not a weapon of war, but a weapon of pressure, a way to tax, a way to dominate, a way to quietly extract wealth from millions of people without them realizing the full cost. And in time, that pressure didn't just create profit. It created resistance, rebellion. Entire populations began to push back against a system they could no longer escape. So how did something so ordinary become powerful enough to shake empires? And what was the system behind it? To understand that, we have to go back. Salt wasn't just seasoning. It was survival. Before refrigeration, before modern storage. Salt was the difference between food that lasted and food that rotted. It preserved meat, protected supplies, allowed societies to store, travel, and survive through harsh seasons. Armies depended on it. Cities depended on it. Entire populations relied on it every single day. And because of that, it sat at the center of life in ways we barely understand today. This wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. And that's what made it powerful. Because when something becomes unavoidable, controlling it means controlling everyone, not through force, not through visible domination, but through access. Who gets it, how much they pay for it, and whether they can live without it. Salt turned into more than a resource. It became leverage, a quiet, constant pressure applied to entire societies. And once rulers began to understand this, they didn't just use salt to sustain their people. They used it to control them. And that's where the system begins to take shape. Long before modern taxation systems, rulers face a constant problem. How do you collect wealth consistently? Land could fail. Harvest could collapse. Trade could slow down. Nothing was truly stable. And without stability, power becomes fragile. So rulers search for something different. Something predictable. Something universal. Something no one could avoid. And over time, they found their answer. Salt. It moved across borders, across cultures, across entire civilizations. It didn't matter if you were a farmer or a king, a soldier or a merchant. You needed salt every day. That made it unique because most goods were optional. Salt was not. It touched the lives of everyone. Quietly, constantly, and slowly, governments began to see what this really meant. This wasn't just a resource. It was leverage, a way to build a system that didn't depend on seasons or chance, a way to create steady income from something people could never stop using. And once that realization took hold, salt stopped being just part of life. It became part of control. Taxes began to form around it. Monopolies began to emerge. And the foundation of a new kind of system was quietly being built, one that didn't rely on force alone, but on necessity itself. And that's where the real problem begins to surface. The moment salt became taxed, survival itself came with a price. Not a choice, not a luxury, a condition of living. For ordinary people, this wasn't just another burden added to daily life. It was inescapable. You couldn't opt out. There was no alternative, no substitute that could replace what salt did for food, for health, for survival. And that's what made the system so powerful. It didn't rely on force at every moment. It relied on necessity. People paid because they had to, not because they agreed, not because they benefited, but because the cost of refusing was even higher. Smuggling was punished. Avoidance was tracked. Resistance was met with consequences. The system closed every exit. And over time, pressure began to build, quietly at first, in homes, in markets, in conversations people had when no one was listening. Because when survival is taxed, it doesn't just create revenue. It creates tension, a slow, growing sense that something isn't right. And that tension doesn't disappear. It spreads. It deepens. Until eventually, the system that once felt stable begins to crack from within, and that's where everything starts to change. What made the salt tax so powerful wasn't just the tax itself. It was how it was enforced. Because a tax alone could be avoided, worked around, even ignored. But this system was different. Salt was no longer just a resource people could produce or trade freely. It was controlled. Monopolies were created. Production was restricted. Distribution was tightly managed. In many places, people were not allowed to collect or sell their own salt, even when it was right in front of them. Coastlines, salt flats, natural sources, all placed under authority. And once control over supply was established, control over people followed. Because now, access itself became regulated, where you could buy it, how much you could have, what price you had to pay. Every step was monitored. This wasn't just about generating revenue anymore. It was about creating dependency, a system where people didn't just pay taxes, they relied on the system to survive. And when dependency becomes total, control becomes effortless, because behavior begins to change. People adjust, comply, adapt to the rules, even when the rules are against them. This wasn't just taxation. It was design, a structure built not just to collect wealth, but to shape how people lived. And once that kind of system is in place, its impact goes far beyond economics. In colonial India, the salt tax reached a breaking point. For years, the system had operated quietly, collecting, controlling, pressuring millions without drawing global attention. But that silence didn't last, because at some point, pressure turns into action. And in 1930, that moment arrived. Mahatma Gandhi made a decision that seemed simple on the surface. He would walk from his home to the sea, hundreds of kilometers, step by step, not to conquer land, not to claim power, but to make salt a basic act, something anyone should have been free to do. And that's what made it powerful, because this wasn't just symbolic. It exposed the system, the idea that even the most essential resource was controlled, taxed, and restricted. As he walked, people followed. Villages joined. Crowds grew. What started as one man's act became a movement. And suddenly, the world was watching. A quiet tax turned into a global spotlight. The system that once operated in the background was now visible to everyone. And in that moment, something changed. Salt was no longer just a necessity. It became a symbol of control, of resistance, of a system people could no longer accept. And once that awareness spreads, it doesn't stay contained. But India wasn't the only place the system took hold. It had already spread far beyond, across Europe and into other parts of the world. Salt became more than a resource. It became a foundation of power. Governments relied on it. Armies were funded by it. Empires quietly expanded through it, because once the model proved effective, it was repeated, refined, strengthened, adapted to fit different regions. In some places, strict monopolies were enforced. In others, heavy taxes were layered on top of controlled distribution, but the structure stayed the same. Limit access, fix the flow, control the price, and dependency would follow. People couldn't escape it. They adjusted, they paid, they endured. But beneath that surface, tension was building, because the more control increased, the more pressure created. And no matter the region, that pressure led to the same outcome: frustration, resistance, unrest. Everywhere the system spread, it carried both wealth and instability with it. And over time, that instability began to reveal something deeper about how power really works. Today, we don't think about salt the same way. It's cheap, accessible, almost invisible in daily life. But the system behind it didn't disappear. It evolved, because modern economies still depend on the same core idea: control what people can't live without. Only now it looks different. Energy, housing, healthcare, data, essentials have changed form, but the structure remains. Access is managed, prices are influenced, distribution is controlled, often by systems too complex to fully see. And just like before, Dependency plays a central role. People organize their lives around these systems. They adapt to them, rely on them, not always by choice, but because there are few alternatives. The difference is subtle. Control is no longer always direct. It's layered, built into policies, embedded in networks that stretch across the world. But once you recognize the pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore because you start to see the same logic everywhere. Different products, same system. And that realization leads to a deeper question about power itself. The real story isn't about salt. It never was. Salt was just the example. A simple way to reveal something much deeper, because power doesn't always look like power. It doesn't always appear as armies or rulers or visible force. Sometimes it hides inside everyday necessities, the things people rely on without thinking, the systems they wake up to and go to sleep with. That's where control becomes strongest, not when people are forced to obey, but when they have no choice but to participate. The most effective systems aren't the ones people fight. They're the ones people can't live without, because resistance becomes risky, costly, sometimes even impossible. And over time, those systems begin to feel normal, accepted, unquestioned. That's what makes them so powerful and so difficult to challenge. Because when control is built into necessity, it disappears from view. And once something becomes invisible, it becomes far harder to break. Which brings us to the final idea this story leaves behind. The salt tax wasn't just a policy. It was a blueprint, a clear example of how something simple can be turned into a system of control. Salt was ordinary, used by everyone, needed every single day. And that's exactly why it worked. Because when something becomes essential, it becomes powerful in the hands of those who control it. This system didn't just generate wealth. It shaped behavior, restructured economies, and quietly extended power across entire populations. But it also revealed something important. Control has limits, because when pressure builds for too long, people begin to push back, resistance forms, awareness spreads, and even the strongest systems begin to crack. All of this triggered by something as small as salt. And that's the real lesson. Power doesn't always come from complexity. Sometimes it comes from controlling the simplest things in life. If this changed how you see history, then you're only scratching the surface. Because behind every empire, there's a system like this waiting to be uncovered. Not always visible, not always obvious, but always there. Hidden structures, invisible forces, quiet mechanisms shaping the world in ways most people never notice. The stories we're told focus on events, battles, leaders, dates, but the real story is often underneath, in the systems that move power, that direct wealth, that shape everyday life without being seen. So, if you want to explore what history doesn't make obvious, subscribe, because once you see the system, you don't just understand the past. You start seeing it everywhere.